So I'm going to start by telling you my story at the end about the most important lesson for me in what feels like a very long career. So when Joanne was saying I've had 17 years experience, it actually feels like it's long. And I think that being a public economist and being in the public service, it's sort of like it's a slightly heavier duty. I think that the most relaxed that I felt was when I was at the IMF for a bit and I was not working on a country that was mine, because your experiences are so personal in terms of what you're analyzing and what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis. So what I have learned is that it's almost impossible for a university to turn out a fully equipped public economist, because there's so much more that you learn once the doors open, and that there's a very big difference between an excellent economist and the public sector economist, and I'm going to tell you why in a moment. So when I first joined the public service, I thought I could write, I could speak, that I could present very clear, concise arguments, that I worked well with people who had very different views from mine, that I was very good at winning an argument convincingly, and that I knew how this economy could work and how it should work. And well, it wasn't meant to be. So when I joined the Treasury, I discovered very quickly that I was at the elementary level in all of these things that I thought I knew how. So who was I when everything that I thought I knew and I could do, I'd gone, I'd studied. My lecturers had given me my pieces of paper, and I thought, wow, I can do lots of things. And I had some very big shoes to fill, because some of the people that you are going to be here today, I worked with. So Andrew Donaldson, who's one of the conveners, was one of the people that I had to work with at the Treasury, and I was looking at him and I'm thinking, okay, how do I become that? Maria Ramos and my current boss, Leseja Khanyaho, and it was a question of how could I one day manage an intelligent response for the great Trevor Manuel, because every time he asked me a question, I would just melt down, and it was just difficult to figure out what to tell him. And it took me a while, but it became quite apparent after a few red pen strokes through every single paper I was writing, lots of shouting, that there was some sort of formula. And the formula included a bit of time, which looked to be quite long, experience, some homework, and lots of unknowns. But what I've discovered over time is that a significant portion of the homework is something that was not there in my university curriculum when I studied at UKZN. It was economic history, because that's something that wasn't emphasized. I did the macroeconomics, the microeconomics, and I didn't do anything on economic history. And economic history has been a very big reference point for me. So my path to my present role was quite windy. When I started my career, at the end of matric, I did not even think I was going to be an economist. If many of you wanted to end up here, good for you, I'm really glad, but I wasn't one of those people. I wanted to be a lawyer. That's what I wanted to be, because I'd been watching LA Law, and that was that, and they had flashy lifestyles. And I saw all of this wordsmithing that was impressing jurists, and I thought, this is what I want to do. I'm a good writer, so I decided I'd either be an attorney or I was going to become a journalist. And so I applied to 2 universities, and it had to be a university away from home. I didn't want to be with my parents, but not too far. So it was either UKZN, because I liked what was happening in the Howard College law department, or it was Rhodes. And UKZN answered first, so that's where I went. And I was a very good law student in my first year. I loved trawling through the past cases, and I had a great memory for detail. But South African law was nothing like I had imagined. Turned out to be quite boring. And I also discovered economics at this time. I guess they had much younger lecturers. I'm sorry, now you know I had a vice as a younger person. So I followed the younger lecturers and the and then I also followed the very interesting American professor that they used to have there at the time, who would end up being one of my postgraduate professors, Bob Klitgaard, who was seconded to UKZN at the time. So I studied economics, but I thought, well, yes, it's fun, but marketing's more my thing. So I was always going into marketing and advertising. But on completing my studies, no one wanted to hire me. Everyone kept saying, go back to school, you're a bit too young, so go back to school. But one advertising company was willing to hire me, and they said, well, we'll hire you, but you must go back to school for another year. But my parents, who are not economists though, clearly understood incentives, because they said to me, well, we've done our bit, so now you must figure out your future on your own. So I got introduced to the concept of debt, and I discovered quite early I was quite scared of debt. So I ended up returning to university to study economics because it looked interesting. And I did not study economics at postgraduate level because of economics itself, the study. It was more about a different way of thinking and viewing and understanding the world. So that was my objective at the end. And I refused to attend many lectures on development economics. No, I just needed the basics so that I could move on. I was going to go into advertising. So you'll not be surprised that my very first job was in market research. I did not start my career off as an economist. And I went into market research. I was researching fast-moving consumer goods and understanding that market. I spent a lot of time designing questionnaires, writing interview instructions, coding questionnaires, writing research reports, and setting up shop shelves. And when I was doing all of that, I didn't know or realize I would end up in a central bank where I'm sitting in the Monetary Policy Committee, where understanding prices and price setting would become something that's a useful skill for me. That was not how it got cobbled up together. And I spent a lot of time shopping for yogurt. So if you were to ask me about yogurt varieties, I know every single thing about yogurts. So the 6-packs that you now see in the shelves did not exist in this market before 1998. So when everyone is talking about memorable policy developments in 1998, my memorable experience of 1998 was the non-Clover launching their first 6-pack and them changing the formula for Yogisip and Inkomazi mass and testing which cow was the best looking. So this is how I got introduced into. So when I say to people, well, yes, my road was windy, it was a very interesting conversation. Interesting way of getting there. And I didn't know when I took my first job that I was going to be referencing a lot of Stats SA questions. So when I was thinking about questionnaire design, I didn't think about conversations I might be having with Statistics South Africa about, well, how are you asking people this employment question? Are you asking them, do you have a job? Or are you asking them, what do you do for a living? Because this is what I learned in my first job. I learned designing questionnaires and sitting with interviewers and saying to them, this is what I want to find out. These are the different ways that you could ask the questions. And also calling the people who had been interviewed just to find out, what did you get asked? Because sometimes you get results that don't look quite right. So spending that bit of time actually in market research was useful for me because it helped me to understand primary research a bit more and why sometimes you get some data that doesn't quite look right. But I didn't learn that from economics. I learned that in my first job doing something that I thought had nothing to do with economics. I also learned in my first job a lot of things about clients and bosses. And in my first job, there was only one way, one answer. Clients and bosses are king. Weekend plans did not matter. So that was my first job, and I quickly learned about this trade-off between work and leisure. The stuff that you were learning about in economics, well, it became a very personal experience. But I was not the star in my first job, by the way. Of my cohort that I came into work with, I was probably the last one to get promoted because I got too bogged down into the little details about how does this questionnaire work? How do you code it in? And I remember my very first boss, Cecile Thornley. I'll never forget her name. She was like that lady in The Devil Wears Prada. She was that boss that I have. And boy, am I grateful that I had her. I remember her calling me into her office and telling me that I am not hired to do administrative work. I've been hired to think about all of these things that I'm doing and how they come together and providing clients with that sort of advice. But at the time of the conversation, I didn't think, hooray, Cecile, you've just given me the recipe for the future and how I should view the world. I really felt a bit oppressed. But by the time my promotion came, it was great. I felt like I had come into it and I fully understood what I was doing. But I was tired from exhaustion. So I left TNS Research Surveys, and I refused the job offer from my client Denon to come and be their research manager. And I also could have been the brand manager for Skippy Peanut Butter, which could have been a completely different path with my economics. So my introduction to the public sector was through the National Electricity Regulator, which you now know as NERSA. But at the time, we were only looking at electricity. And in this job, I learned for the first time what regulatory economics is. Because in my studies, I had been studying microeconomics. I'd been studying monopolies and different market structures and what they mean and how price setting works. But I had never studied regulators themselves and the things that influence regulators when they set prices, and in terms of ensuring that monopolies do not abuse their dominance. That was a completely new area of work for me, which allowed me to expand my economics somewhat. And I learned that my regulatory economics is part economics and part law. So that first year of university was maybe not a bad choice in terms of trawling through legislation, because I was now involved in a process where, as an economist, I was providing input into how a piece of legislation would enable a regulator to function and how a piece of legislation would enable a regulator to set prices. It's something that I hadn't thought of before I joined the electricity regulator. And that was not the reason why they hired me. I think when they hired me, they thought, oh, there she is. She's young, she studied economics, she's looking for work. That was the match. So they probably thought I was going to add to the regulator, but I think I probably learned more from the regulator in my first year in terms of value add. It was only after I fully understood what regulatory economics was about that I could probably start to add value. But it also made me realize that until then I had been living in a bubble in a way. I'd been living in this world and I was half asleep. This was my experience because my orientation was more about the private sector and how things worked there, but I never fully understood how the public sector works. I never understood about the process of keeping our lights on. I never understood the process of, well, how does the state relate to Eskom, which is an entity that is owned by the state? What does that mean for the government's own accounts? And that is something that I learned through interaction with people like Anton Eberhardt and Javier Stein, who were electricity gurus that I worked with at the time. I also learned something which I had never thought I would. Like if I went into a textbook and a textbook told me something was a natural monopoly, I thought that was it. It was fixed, it was given. In my mind, the electricity sector was a natural monopoly. I didn't know until I went into the sector that there are parts that are a natural monopoly, but there are parts that could be broken up, where you could have some level of competition in that sector. And that was a very useful experience for me. So when I joined the regulator in 2000, we were looking at two areas at the time. The first area of work we were looking at was electricity distribution. So how could electricity distribution be reorganized to be more efficient, to work for consumers? So at least this is what the policy document told us. But in doing that work of understanding electricity distribution and how it was set up, one had to think about reorganization and what are the implications. What does this mean for different income streams for the municipalities, for Eskom, and for the electricity users? So that was a very useful exercise for me to undertake and apply my economics in a very different way. The second area, which is still also not completed in South Africa, was a discussion on how to break up Eskom into individual generating plants that could compete with each other. And I spent a bit of time looking at the experience of other countries and how other countries then had broken up their electricity sector. So that was a very useful discussion for me to understand that not all market structures are fixed in the way that you might think of as you are an economics student that is learning about just broader microeconomics. So in 2003, on being prompted by my husband to think about something else more broader, because things were becoming difficult at home, he worked at Eskom and I worked for the regulator, and we could never discuss anything at home about work. So he promptly encouraged me to move on and look for other work. And so it was that I applied for a job at the National Treasury. And little did he know at the time that that was going to be it for the rest of our lives. We could never, ever discuss work at home for a long time, because some things were meant to follow me forever. So I joined the Treasury for what was to be a 3 to 5 year stint. I was never going to stay at the Treasury for long. I was a great believer of moving from an employer, grabbing what you could from them, and then moving on to another employer. And I ended up staying at the Treasury for 12 years. And you're going to ask yourself, what was she doing for 12 years? So no, I was not necessarily in the same job for 12 years. But what was lovely about the Treasury is that it was a place where one could reinvent themselves as an economist in terms of the different things that one could do. And also what I liked from the Treasury is there were so many people that I could learn from. So in my first role, I spent a lot of time looking at market structure issues. Electricity regulation, of course, followed me in a different path. But I see Richard Good here, and at the time he was looking at transport issues. So I looked at transport infrastructure and pricing issues. So I spent a good chunk of my time doing a little bit of that work. I then also spent some time understanding different sectors, understanding the manufacturing industry, understanding the agricultural industry, and the changes that had happened in the industry over time. Agriculture is sort of some sort of pet project of mine, because it's a very interesting sector when one follows what happened in South Africa post 1994 about a sector. So we used to have all of these small cooperatives in the agricultural sector. So we had a banana board, we had, I don't know, all manner of boards that were dismantled. And of course, one of the decisions that were taken was that we were dismantling the boards. But around many of those small co-ops and the food boards that we used to have, we had a certain organization of how the infrastructure was organized around those things. And when we left farmers and as individual farmers, we were basically dismantling the way that those sectors were working. In some of the areas, we used to have some sort of a rail network that would pick up at specific times. And some of that stopped to work. When you are an individual farmer, you have a smaller load of goods. And that changes how you, the infrastructure that you need around you. Suddenly, you're putting more of your goods on the road. And before, you also had some sort of organization. The relationship with the millers would have been slightly different. So many things have changed around the structure of South African agriculture. There were rules and regulations that were introduced by the state in terms of what we wanted to happen around farming in terms of land tenure, that resulted in some changes in terms of how farmers made their investment decisions. So there are little things that happen as we make policy decisions that are not always evident. So these are things that I've learned about as I've studied different sectors in as a public sector economist. I've also delved into looking into regulatory impact analysis. And regulatory impact analysis is about the impact of any rule that government is putting into place. Understanding at the beginning, what is the problem that you're trying to resolve? Will the rule that you're introducing solve that problem? Firstly, could you look at other options? Will it result in other unintended consequences? And what do all of those things mean? Because these are all direct and indirect costs to the economy. And do the costs of the decisions that you are making outweigh the benefits sometimes? So, and how does one balance those things? I've gotten involved in the budget process, which is like a whole other area of work. So when you are an economist and you're just looking at where's growth going, and you are coming up with growth projections, some of the times if you're not involved in the actual public finance management, it's very difficult for you to see the different trade-offs, because public finance management is about economic trade-offs. It's also about political economy trade-offs. It's also about balancing the choices within the limited budget that the Treasury has. And I've learned a lot of things in terms of working with public finance economists in that area, because it opens up your mind in a slightly different way. So in having been exposed to all of these little things at the Treasury, I would say that my greatest learning came from when I started to interact with investors, and when I also had to get involved in writing the actual budget chapters. because all of these things that you're doing must come up as part of a story. So when you meet with investors, and you are a public sector economist who works for the Treasury, you come and tell them the budget is going up. Well, we're either going to be in deficit, or our budget is in balance, or we're going to run a surplus, and this is our growth projection. They want to get an answer from you about how they will maximize their return. And if you are a country that is borrowing money from investors, you have to account to investors all the time. So those interactions with investors help me to think quite carefully about, what am I doing? What do the numbers that I'm producing mean? What kind of economy does South Africa have? Does our policy advice have traction, or are we just all running on a treadmill? So I came in at the tail end of Edgar's presentation, and he was asking this question about, is it possible to have the right policies but have no impact? And his answer was spot on, that you can. But when you interact with investors who are putting their money in your country, these are some of the things that you have to think about quite carefully about. Where is this economy going, and what is your advice? What is your view of the South African economy? I've also been involved in the in the International Trade and Administration Commission, GTAC, which was a very different experience to what I've had. So GTAC sets the trade tariffs for South Africa. So the import tariffs that we have, the duties. And within GTAC, you will get presentations from various industry players that want protection. So they will come and say, well, there are goods being dumped by China in South Africa. So you have to establish some evidence of dumping. Are goods being dumped by the Chinese, or is this an issue of a South African industry that is not being competitive? And I've learned a lot of things from those interactions, because it teaches you to ask a different set of questions about our level of tariffs. What does it mean to impose a tariff? If you are saying you're imposing a tariff, who is going to end up paying? Are you increasing the costs of inputs to the economy? Are you increasing the price level within the economy? And to what benefit, to what end? So a business can come to you and say, well, we have 50 employees, and those 50 employees are going to lose their jobs. So we need to get protection. So this is what GTAC has to make a decision on, is will that decision to protect those 50 jobs outweigh a decision of maybe adding a 1 rand increase to whatever the good is, and what is the impact on employers? And that's not always a very straightforward answer, because I guess as government we have multiple objectives, which I'm sure you might have heard about from various speakers or different presentations that will come in through the week. But because my time is limited and I want to allow you to ask some questions, I'm not going to go into many specifics. But there are many trade-offs that come up in terms of policy making. Now, visiting the International Monetary Fund gave me a different type of exposure as a public economist, because I worked with African countries that had such different economies, such different economies. So the 23 countries I was responsible for only had 4 middle-income countries in them. The rest of them were low-income countries. I had specific views of what a treasury looks like when you walk into a treasury. And I had a very different view of what a statistical agency looks like and what data a statistical agency produces. I had a very different view of what a central bank looks like and what a central bank does. And I have discovered that there are very different ways of doing things across the continent. I've worked with pure cash economies that made me rethink and revisit the economics that I learned at university. So when you live here, this is the South Africa that you know. When you spend time looking at South Africa, looking at Western economies that are advanced, you pretty much have a set of indicators that you can reference that is comparable to understand a country's level of development, to understand whether a country is well managed or not. It's very different when you look at countries that are smaller, that have capacity issues, that have got data constraint, where inflation numbers come out like twice a year. You don't get them every month like you do here. Where accounts of a country are sort of still run semi-manually, and there is full central allocation of resources, but someone who needs money needs to walk, a department has to go to a treasury to get a piece of paper that gives it its allocation. And they take that piece of paper from the treasury and they walk to the central bank to get some cash. That's a very different type of economy and how it's organized. So I have great appreciation, I think, now of the things probably that we have in South Africa, but also on how things are done differently elsewhere. Also learned a little bit about economic diplomacy, which I sort of took to be a word before. But economic diplomacy is like a big thing. So I had countries that I was representing in the IMF board where government were doing things that sort of didn't make sense. They know they're running out of money, but they're just spending the cash. But they need a lot of help from the international community. And someone has to go and speak for them and defend them. At the same time, that same someone has to tell them that what they're doing is absolute lunacy, but keep a relationship going so that they don't close the doors. So I have to say it's quite a skillful thing to try to do. I haven't quite mastered it yet, but I think that it's something that's quite important in one's economic career. So in short, this is what I've learned. What is a public economist? An analyst, an advisor, a student of history, and a teacher in a big sense. Because there are many things that we learn about when we are working on public sector issues that the general public doesn't know. And part of it also is because we ourselves are learning, because the university system will never be able to equip us fully about what it is that the public service does, and the different trade-offs that have to be made on a day-to-day basis. And on reflection, some 8 years ago, I realized that with hindsight, there are a number of things I could have asked my lecturers about at university. So for those of you who are still students, so here are a few of my tips to you. Trade policy in South Africa still needs a bit of attention. So if you can pay a bit more attention to trade policy and the trade-offs, because trade policy is more politics than anything. It's a very fine balancing act. It's an area that I wish I had asked Mel Holden about a bit more when she was teaching me at university. I wish I had listened more closely in my maritime economics lectures. This is yet another area where we don't know or we don't have sufficient people in our economy who follow maritime economics. Yet, a lot of the things that you consume in your household, a lot of the things that you buy in stores are driven by pricing of shipping lines and many, many things in terms of pricing around ports and things like that. So this is an area that I wish I had asked a bit about. And I wish I had studied development economics. I hope some of you are students of development economics, because I think development is an area that some of us will do because it's part of the curriculum. But taking an interest in development economics when you are a public economist, I think, is quite important, because 80% of the things that the state should be doing are about development. The rest of them are simply the state enabling the private sector to function as it should. So development economics is one area. And of course, I had Bob Klitgart here, and he'd done a lot of work on corruption when he was my teacher back then, but I didn't think that this was an issue for my country back then, and I never asked him the question. So I think I'll end off there, and then I'll leave you to ask me questions. Thank you.